Hey folks, with last Saturday's announcement that Fallout 5 will be coming in 2026, made you look. I thought it would be interesting to revisit one of modern Fallout's more controversial elements. If you were to ask a room full of fans of the late 90s Fallout games what they like most about Fallout's Bethesda era, ignoring New Vegas because I'm sorry, as a New Vegas worshipper, we are the most annoying people on the planet, I'd imagine a lot of them would tell you about funny quests they enjoyed or their favorite changes to the power armor system. For one or two of them, I'm sure meeting Nick Valentine was the moment they realized they were gay. If, however, you were to ask this room of fans what they like the least about Bethesda Fallout, you are bound to hear a number of people bemoan the unfortunate Flanderization of the series' super mutants. Largely gone are the ideologically supremacist super mutants of the Unity, or the quiet self-reflection of Broken Hills' Marcus, replaced primarily with dim-witted brutes who somehow exist in unreasonably huge quantities all across the United States, despite earlier games implying this to be unlikely. A lot of people have had an understandably adverse reaction to these changes. Well, they aren't really changes, but we'll touch on that in due time, in a way that I find much more interesting than knee-jerk criticisms like fusion cores destroyed canon, the soda armor ruined the Enclave, or I'm not gay, mom, I'm dressing up as Nick Valentine because he's cool. As later entries in the series have morphed our collective view of what a super mutant is, I think something has genuinely been lost. The average new fan of the series could be totally forgiven for assuming the super mutant race is nothing more than a stupid monster to be put down in between looting screws from some pencil pusher's desk fan, and Vats targeting Arthur Maxon's smug little face. What I would like to propose today is one hypothetical way that 2077's Fallout 5, yeah, that's two Fallout 5 jokes, we're really creative over here at Edgier Than Thou Inc., might use some of Bethesda's existing lore elements to improve the fanbase's perception of super mutants and develop them into a more interesting community after the Master's downfall. The first three suggestions I will make before getting to my most interesting ideas are the obvious ones that I think almost everybody has considered at some point. 1. Have there be fewer of them. Unless Fallout 5 revisits the setting of a pre-existing game or unironically introduces a new faction that created FEV mutants in an entirely different geographical location, having encampments of mutants all across the map is almost guaranteed to feel cheap and pointless. While I don't have a problem with small numbers of super mutants being created either through very specific unexpected circumstances or in a few active labs on the coasts, I am of the opinion that the general trend should be that the initial burst in super mutant populations from the Unity or the Institute or wherever else are behind us, and without intervention, the number of mutants is on the decline. 2. Include more casual super mutants. Games like Fallout New Vegas or Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC helped to improve the state of Bethesda super mutants by including mutant characters who simply existed in the world. I think without any of the other ideas I am soon to deliver, a few more well-rounded super mutant citizens would do a future game some good, because, I'm sorry, the current quantity is not enough. 3. Allow players to play as super mutants. With Fallout 76's recent Ghoul update, I think this possibility is more within reach than it ever has been. If players were given the ability to exist as a super mutant in the post-apocalypse, experiencing the physical toughness of a child of FEV alongside the prejudices of wary towns and settlements, I think they would develop a new appreciation for the inner workings of an otherwise mysterious branch in evolution. For reasons I may get into in a future video, I also think that this concept is relevant to a potential Fallout 1 remaster. Any of these ideas, if implemented in a thoughtful way, have the potential to improve the community's relationship with mutants, but the primary purpose of this video isn't to just preach to the choir. Instead, what I have decided to do is develop a rudimentary basis for a hypothetical super mutant faction that could appear in a future game to introduce interesting role-playing opportunities and change a player's reaction upon seeing a super mutant from spamming the VATS key to spamming the dialogue key. I know that's not a thing that people do, just go with me here. I hope it goes without saying that what I'm about to tell you amounts almost entirely to fan fiction, so I don't want anyone to get the idea that I feel like I know better than the developers, or that there aren't a million different ways to improve our relationship with the mutant population. Plus, maybe you think my ideas are stupid garbage. I certainly wouldn't fault you. Anyhow, the faction I've invented is a mid-sized community of mutants, humans, and ghouls who have built a modest town out of a pre-war strip mall and surrounded the property in a wooden fence. Notably, they would include numerous super mutants from California, the Institute, and Vault 87, each of which would be distinguishable by differences in appearance, of course. Various food vendors and shopkeepers would occupy old world stores, much like a modern mall, though they'd be a bit more cramped as the complex has to support a larger, consistent population. What used to be a parking lot will have been converted converted into a farmer's market style area with a few more shops and some recreation and entertainment like street performers, carnival games, a touch of gambling, though nothing too extreme in that vein. This would give an opportunity for the player to see what kinds of changes would need to be made for a population made up of beings with drastically varying physical prowess and age. I envision one booth having an old pre-war ghoul who will regale the player with tales of his exploits and dispense wisdom. He'll have a tip jar placed in front of them but will talk to the player for free. Choosing to give him money will result in unique dialogue, as will challenging his stories and advice, or attempting to steal the tip jar, an act which will not cause him to turn hostile, but would cause him to treat the player more like a child whose behavior needs to be corrected. Upon visiting one of the carnival games that tests a person's strength or endurance, like one of those booths that you see at the fair that says, hang on to this bar for 60 seconds to win $100, players would have a chance of encountering a super mutant citizen in an argument with a worker who doesn't want to serve the mutant because the games are far too easy for them and are starting to eat into the booth's profits. The worker would comment that most mutants avoid their booth because they consider the game to be too easy, leading to the mutant offering to play the game for free because, as it turns out, they were never in it for the money and actually just enjoyed hanging from the bar. I don't think that this kind of an interaction is quest-worthy necessarily, but I do think it would be fun to have a dialogue option where the player has the opportunity to either leave the two to their own devices, convince the worker to ban mutants from playing altogether, or suggest a partnership where the mutant could serve as a company mascot of sorts and suggest to human patrons that succeeding at these games makes you feel strong like a super mutant. This town will, absent a relevant skill check, ban the player from bringing in weapons, much like a New Vegas casino, storing these weapons in a locker near the town gate. This would lead to a potential encounter where an enterprising raider steals one of the player's weapons, being spooked off by the town's guard before they have the chance to steal the rest. This would lead to a short, unmarked quest where the player steals back their stolen property, which is admittedly a bit derivative of Fallout 2, where the player's car can be stolen, but let me have my fun. Before we get into the bigger stuff, if you're enjoying this so far, I would love if you consider checking out the first few chapters of my post-apocalyptic science fiction novel, The Empath, linked in the description. It's not particularly Fallout-inspired or anything, but if you like character work and engaging dialogue in an unforgiving setting, you might enjoy yourself. If you still aren't convinced, you can check out my announcement video, which includes a more in-depth pitch that might pique your interest. That'll be linked up in the corner, as well as, of course, in the description. Anyhow, back to your regularly scheduled programming. At the higher level, this faction has a few conflicts that it's dealing with. The occupants of the town primarily bunk inside a former Super Duper Mart, a fact which leads the faction's mayor, Sean, to jokingly call the community the Super Duper Mutants, much to everyone else's chagrin. Upon the player's arrival, the facility is segregated into human/ghoul bunking on one side and mutant bunking on the other. Originally, this was a practical decision, as mutants need larger beds than humans, so it made sense to build dedicated bunks for both populations, but the town's leadership has started to notice a disconnect between the human ghoul residents and the mutant residents, as hints of distrust are beginning to develop. One immediate impact the player can have is convincing the relevant officials to pick a specific path in the bunking crisis. The player can influence the town to keep things as they are, furthering the divide between the citizens, or they can suggest a new method of organizing sleeping arrangements that's a bit less efficient at the cost of being more equitable. This alteration will frustrate many residents in the short term as they're forced to move across the building to accommodate these changes, and will put additional strain on the town's resources, requiring them to assemble new beds and walls, as well as rework the walkways on what used to be the human side of the building to be a bit wider for mutants. I'm sure there are plenty of other options here, but that's a rough outline for the crisis. I mentioned Sean earlier. I should probably address her. Sean is an Institute super mutant who traveled to Malachi's Fallout 5, wherever it's located, and settled down in what is now the hometown of the Super Duper Mutants. She at some point learned the name of the Institute's director and chose his name as her own, both as a symbol of appreciation for the organization that created her, as well as a way of representing the Institute's ideals in a positive way. She understood that the Institute was largely a force for evil in the Commonwealth, but aspired to some of the ideals it claimed to believe in. She has a sense of humor, but not in the sarcastic kind that a lot of Fallout characters tend to have. She's a bit more like Harold in the earlier entries, though she's a bit more driven than he was. She's quite old by this point and enjoys simple jokes and wordplay, and will gladly argue with the player about her beliefs without judging them too harshly. Sean herself is a former dumb brute mutant who, by some mechanism she doesn't understand, started to regain her human intelligence and question her mutant gang's relationship with humanity and whether raiding and pillaging was the right thing to do. Where Sean differed from other instances of this in the past is that her small band of mutant siblings slowly came around to her way of thinking as well and followed her to this new location. Saying this out loud, I can sort of see how a person might come away with the impression that this character is derivative of like Marcus or Neil or someone like that. So I do want to make clear that I envision her both in personality and in general interest to be quite a bit different from either of them. For instance, she's a much more scientifically inclined character. In general, I like to think of her as someone who might have met Marcus at some point and agreed with a lot of his ideas and decided to implement them herself. She at some point prior to the game's events became aware of several other mutants who experienced the same phenomenon, much like Fallout 4's Erickson. While many of the super mutants in town were those who maintained their intelligence from start to finish, a good few are like Erickson and Sean, though nobody knows exactly what brought them back to their old ways of thinking. One of Sean's goals is to find a reliable method of repairing a mutant's psyche, and this goal will comprise the faction's primary questline. If the player engages in dialogue with Sean long enough, they will learn that she has a deep secret that she's not willing to reveal, and that she seems genuinely afraid to tell the player. This will be important later, obviously, because why else would I mention it? The player would be sent on various quests, potentially with a new super mutant companion. I have an idea for a specific one that you're likely to either love or find really stupid, but we'll get there when we get there, to help negotiate with nearby hesitant factions for supplies, collect chemical ingredients, and deliver test cures to violent super mutants either captured or in the wild. I'm not going to touch on the details of these other bigoted factions outside, but just know that they exist and they're another problem that the mutants are dealing with. The fact that the player's testing these cures on what amounts to human subjects will be both a source of moral ambiguity and a spot for the player to prematurely end this quest line by convincing Sean that this path is unethical and causing her to end the project. If the player continues, however, the first few cures the community develops will cause adverse reactions in the test subjects, necessitating that they need to be quickly put out of their misery. A high science skill or relevant perk might reduce the number of times that this happens, but it can't be prevented entirely. Eventually, a cure will be developed that can reliably return super mutants to their previous mental states with about a 90% success rate. There will not be a way to do this perfectly. If the cure is developed, it will always be potentially fatal, and the player, as well as Sean, will have to live with the fact that while they've helped to restore a lot of memories and personalities, they've also potentially ended the lives of many innocent people who never chose to have their memories and personalities fractured. This cure will likely create at least 2 new named NPCs from feral super mutants. Rather than come up with backstories for them, I'll let you imagine what they might be like. And while we're at it, feel free to think of a name for this town, because I didn't come up with one. If it were up to me, at least one of the mutants that you cured would also be a potential companion. As I said before, Sean is harboring a dangerous secret, and as the player begins to gain her trust, she becomes increasingly likely to share it with them. There will, of course, be an alternate way of discovering her secret before she's ready to divulge, leading to an opportunity to confront her or potentially ruin things for her. The secret, of course, is a super mutant behemoth, which she has imprisoned somewhere off-site, probably in a warehouse, though I'm open to more interesting solutions. This behemoth, which was previously a friend of hers, represents the pinnacle of her plans. If she can cure him, she will be satisfied with her life. The player is likely to be unnerved by this, as behemoths are naturally harder to empathize with and are more of a risk to work around, but if they choose not to kill him or ignore him, or convince Sean that she should end his suffering, they will have an opportunity to modify the cure in order to help restore his mental state. Doing this will require at least one relatively high-level skill/perk check, as well as a bit of extra research, but curing him will be possible, leading to a friendly super mutant behemoth to talk to and a completion of Sean's questline. Overall, that's the basic idea behind the super mutants, the general conflict they're dealing with, and what their faction is like on a day-to-day basis. I'd love to hear any thoughts or feedback that you might have in the comments, as this is really just a preliminary idea, and I'm sure you can find plenty of flaws with it. That said, I mentioned a few things that I haven't really circled back to yet. Firstly, I mentioned in the intro that Bethesda hasn't really changed super mutants, and I meant that. They created entirely new instances of mutants with their own properties. While I understand the reason that this would be controversial, I also think that this faction has the opportunity to celebrate these differences in mutant origins by having varied NPCs with unique backstories. Some might be former members of the Master's Army, while others experience their mutation as blacking out and waking up years later in clothes and a body they don't recognize, trying to piece together what happened to them and what they did during the time they were full-on feral. The second thing I mentioned before was a potential new companion, and here's where I may lose some of you if I haven't already. It should probably be pretty obvious that a faction like the one I've described is an opportunity for the series to bring back a couple of characters we've met before. Popular mutants like Lily Bowen, Dog/God, Marcus, Uncle Leo, Neil, Fox, Frank Horrigan's headless torso, I don't know, Davison, or an uncured Virgil if you're freaky like that. I do think that Marcus probably deserves a mention or a reference by a couple of characters, as he's got to be pretty goddamn famous among super mutants as some sort of a folk hero, even though he's fucking useless in combat, which I'd show you if I had properly recorded our little massacre of the Hebologists. But I like the idea of characters not really knowing what happened to him. Maybe he died peacefully, maybe he's still out there building bridges and mending relationships, maybe he died when the Chosen One got pissed he was just sitting there there and watching them get all the sick Hebologist kills. The two mutants I'd most like to see pop up again are Fallout 4's Strong, the Institute super mutant who misunderstood the language of Macbeth and now seeks the milk of human kindness in the hope that it'll make him powerful enough to defeat humans for good, and Fallout New Vegas' Tabitha, the self-appointed leader of the state of Utopia, kidnapper of Raoul, and pretty good radio host. To me, Strong seems like an incomplete character in 4. His story doesn't feel finished, and I think there's a huge opportunity to show a more refined Strong living with the SDMs who remembers his time with the Soul Survivor fondly and has grown to appreciate coexistence with humans. I imagine he might have a very simple quest that asks the player to help him find a tailor to make him a new outfit or something like that, just to get the player exploring a new area and generally helping out an old friend. But overall, I anticipate him being a minor character that you can just stop by and talk to. I'm sure he'd also make the occasional joke about the milk of human kindness, leading the player to wonder whether he's messing with us or whether he never realized he was chasing an enigma. By contrast, Tabitha is a recruitable companion in Malachi's Fallout 5. Since she was reunited with Rhonda, her best friend Mr. Handy, during the events of Fallout New Vegas, she traveled far and wide with her friend until at some point the two drifted apart. They realized that their journeys had changed them both and they were no longer compatible as friends. A dejected but ultimately more mature Tabitha settled down where we meet her, but never fully acclimatized. Itching for a new goal in life, she takes the first opportunity she gets to travel with the player and get to see the world. She would attempt to help with negotiations, where her love for showbiz might help in some circumstances, while her poor social skills might hurt in others. Her companion quest would relate to her relationship with Rhonda, who could be found at a different settlement. Through a series of conversations and events, as well as a random encounter with Rhonda out in the wild that can only trigger when Tabitha is recruited, the player can talk her through their relationship, either convincing her that Rhonda was a terrible friend and should be forgotten, that she should cherish her time with Rhonda but move forward with new relationships, or that she and Rhonda could rekindle their relationship in a healthier way. This outcome would see the two reconnecting, but maintaining a more traditional friendship where they occasionally visit each other, send letters, that sort of thing, allowing both of them to maintain their personal space. If we're feeling especially modern, then perhaps the two would start a podcast, much like their old radio show. Personally, I like the idea that Mr. Handys are sentient anyway, but if that's too lore unfriendly for y'all, then she can be explained away as having been modified over time by Tabitha and other friends along the way until she gained sentience. Tabitha and a few other Nightkin would offer additional flavor to the faction, with most of their Stealth Boy related afflictions being under control, but serving as an additional challenge as, while they're in a better spot now, the adverse effects of long-term Stealth Boy use still occasionally cause them distress and depression, something which the player can help with in small ways through dialogue and through fetching various sentimental items and a new chem that's some sort of a powerful sleep pill. But anyway, that's my idea. I hope that you liked it. I had a lot of fun thinking about various possibilities for super mutants, and I overall like the general concept I've outlined here. I definitely left some stuff out, but I wanted to make this at least a little bit streamlined. I'd love to hear your feedback. I'm sure there are some details I'm missing here or there, as I'm by no means a deep lore expert, but otherwise, please consider checking out the first few chapters of The Empath in the description or the announcement video for more information. Like this video if you liked it, subscribe to this channel if you liked me, and I will see you at an indeterminate point in the future. Also, they should bring back talking Deathclaws, I swear to God.